So we're going to talk about vertebrates now. And so remember, vertebrates are a group within phylum Chordata. And we've talked about two groups of invertebrates that belong to phylum Chordata, the tunicates and the lancelets. The majority of phylum Chordata, however, is the vertebrates. And that's what we're going to focus on now. Now, to remind you, there are four characteristics that define phylum Chordata. That is the dorsal hollow nerve cord, the notochord, the post-anal tail, and the pharyngeal gill slits. So when we talk about vertebrate characteristics, remember they have all four of these, and then in addition, they have several traits that define them as well. So they have a cranium. A cranium is also known as a skull, so a protective or bony or cartilaginous housing for the brain. So it can be made of bone, it can be made of cartilage. They have a segmented vertebral column, which is obviously where the name vertebrate comes from. And so the notochord is replaced by a bony or cartilaginous column of interlocking vertebrae. So the notochord gives rise to the vertebral column in vertebrates. They have an endoskeleton that's either cartilage or bone, and we saw that referenced again in the cranium and the vertebra being made out of that. And then most of them also have two pairs of appendages, but we'll see a couple of exceptions to that, but most of them have two pairs of appendages. In addition to these sort of primary features, they also have internal organs at a level of complexity greater than a lot of other animals. So liver, kidneys, endocrine glands, and a heart with at least two chambers. The liver itself is totally unique to vertebrates. The heart, kidneys, and the endocrine system, endocrine is your hormone system, just to remind you, are all more complex than the structures in other groups. So other groups have heart and kidney and endocrine system, but not at the level that vertebrates have. And then their Hox genes are multiplied. And so remember Hox genes were a trait of animals generally, and they're important for body plan development. But we see a multiplication of Hox genes in the vertebrates, and we think that this allows for some of the more complex body plans that we see in vertebrates, since those genes are important for body plan formation. So there are several major groups of vertebrates that we'll be discussing, and so this is a cladogram that shows those different groups and highlights some of the traits. So we'll be going through and talking about many different traits of these organisms, but the cladogram outlines some of the major traits, especially as they relate to their ability to colonize water, land, and air. And especially when we get to some of the later groups, we'll talk about how their major traits are adapted for land. I do want to point out one thing. I'm not going to go through this whole thing here, but I want to point out this position right here. We see this critical innervation of lungs at this node. And notice that after that node, we have mammals, reptiles, amphibians. Those you probably know have lungs. But what is shocking to most people are these two. These are the ray-finned fish and the lobe-finned fish that we'll talk about today. And you probably know that most fish don't have lungs. And notice I said most because we'll talk about an exception, but most fish do not have lungs. And yet here it is, lungs as an innovation that they supposedly have, right? And so this is going to just be a challenging point for you. I'm going to say it now. I'll say it again later on as well. Lungs evolved in an ancestor that existed here in the cladogram. So remember, this is back in time. There was an ancestor that had a lung. The fish lost that lung. okay, most of the fish. And then the other organisms kept the lung, okay? So technically, ray-finned fish and lobe-finned fish inherited a lung from an ancestor, but they did something else with it, okay? And that's why we see lung here on the cladogram. Okay, but we got a little ahead of ourselves just because I wanted to highlight that. Let's start with our more early vertebrates that are really unusual and not familiar to you probably. So Cyclostomata is the first group of vertebrates. And so they're here on the, whoops, wrong direction. They're here on the cladogram. So they're the earliest diverged group of vertebrates. They do have the vertebral column, the cranium, and the endoskeleton that vertebrates have. But they do not have jaws, which is a later innovation. Okay, so that's what they don't have. So they lack jaws. They also lack eyes, fins. And in the case of hagfish, which are part of Cyclostomata, they also don't have vertebrae. Okay, so you're probably confused right now because they're a vertebrate and they don't have vertebrae. But just like with lungs, it's about what the ancestor had. So the hagfish had an ancestor that had vertebrae. They lost that vertebral column. So they, again, kind of back evolved this term that we've used before to not having a vertebral column. So their ancestral relationship says that they're vertebrates, even though they don't have vertebrae anymore. So they have a skeleton that does have a notochord, and not the vertebrae, and they also have that cartilaginous cranium. Because they don't have eyes, they're basically blind, but they have a really good sense of smell. Interestingly, they have a protective mechanism where if something grabs onto it, they start giving off this like really, really, really huge amount of slime. And you can check out this video to see just how much slime it is. It's pretty impressive. Lampreys are another group in Cyclostomata. They're also jawless and also don't have appendages. They do, however, have a rudimentary vertebral column. They have a really interesting mouth. So remember, they're jawless, but they have a circular mouth that can grab on to their food and suck on it. Many of them are parasitic or also, like in this case, kind of decomposing this fish. Okay, so that's the Cyclostomata. So their really key defining trait is that they're jawless, and that makes them very different from later vertebrates. So all vertebrates after the lamprey and hagfish are jawed vertebrates. The first jawed organisms were fish. The jaw, a real jaw has a hinge. Okay, so a hinged jaw opens and shuts like this. And they developed probably from the pharyngeal slits. So when we look at primitive jawless fish, we see these gill arches and then the gill slits in between them. And then an early jawed fish, so here's the jaws. So this part of the gill slits and gill arches were modified to make the jaw instead. Okay, and then that became even more well adapted in modern fish. So this is the modern jaw of fish today. And again, notice that there's displacement of the gill arches from the ancient jawless fish. In addition to the jaw, these fish also evolved appendages. So the lampreys and hagfish did not have appendages. We also see appendages arise in fish as well. That's the fins. Okay, so the early jawed vertebrates had the advantage of both fins and jaws. So how would this be advantageous? It's all about finding food, right? So fins let you go find food more efficiently. You can move just more efficiently than if you're just relying on, you know, the motion without appendages. And jaws also let you grab onto that food better. So not only can you move to find food more efficiently, you can also grab onto food better. And so this allows them to eat things that are bigger than them, basically, because you can take off pieces of it rather than only being able to fit in what you relying on fitting in stuff. So that's a big advantage over a lot of other animals. because it's more efficient at doing that. So even though, like, say, the lamprey could grab onto that fish, it can't tear off a chunk. It's kind of having to suck on the organism, and it's not as efficient as the hinged jaw. So our modern groups of jawed vertebrates start with class Chondrichthyes. The common name for this is the sharks, skates, and rays. They're also sometimes called the cartilaginous fish because they have a skeleton made of cartilage instead of bone. Interestingly, this is a derived character rather than an ancestral one. So again, this gets a little tricky about evolution. Basically, they had an ancestor who had a bony skeleton, and that bony ancestor changed into the modern cartilaginous one. So bony skeleton ancestor, we got evolution to cartilaginous skeleton of the modern sharks, skates, and rays. So this is a developmental change. So basically in bony skeleton organisms, there's a process in embryonic development where ossification occurs. So ossification is the hardening of the bone. And then in the cartilaginous fish, that process is prevented, so it doesn't happen. So there's a conversion of cartilage into bone in most vertebrates, but in the cartilaginous fishes, that process doesn't happen in the embryo. Sharks are known for their teeth. So there's a teethy smile of a shark. They were the earliest fish to develop teeth. You can see in this picture, they're not set into the jaw. So they have these rows of teeth, and this allows them to just constantly lose their teeth. So the teeth can just fall out, and there's a whole bunch of other teeth already there to replace them. So they're just continuously kind of moving forward new teeth in their mouths. If you find shark teeth, or you've ever seen shark teeth necklaces, for example, those teeth are just always falling out. They don't have to kill the shark to get those. What's the advantage to teeth? So they're the earliest fish to develop teeth. And so the teeth even expand on the benefits of a jaw. They allow them to tear, right? So they're using that hinged jaw to grab onto food bigger than them, and then they have these sharp teeth that can tear off a piece. So skates and rays are also part of this group. And so how they compare is they have a flattened body form compared to sharks. So still made of cartilage, similar in many ways, but their bodies have this long, flat shape. So other interesting traits of sharks, they're actually denser than water. So if you just put them in water, they will sink. And so in order to not sink, they always have to be moving. So even when they're sleeping, they're just slowly moving through water. That's the only way they maintain buoyancy. The other reason why they also constantly have to move has to do with their gills. So they use their gills to get oxygen from the water, like we've talked about before. In other fish that we'll talk about, they have a structure that moves on their gills. So if I'm a fish, my gills are here. A lot of fish have a structure here that opens and closes, and as it does that, think about it, it's moving water next to the gills. But sharks don't have that, and so they don't have a way to get water to move through their gills unless they're moving. So they always have to be swimming to get water to pass through their gills and get oxygen. They have a powerful sense of smell, so they're hunters, and so this helps them be good hunters. They have really good senses. So they also have a special sense called the lateral line. It's the ability to detect vibration. So again, helping them find food. This also allows them to detect electromagnetic fields. This one is really strange. You can look up some videos online about this. If you put a magnet next to a shark, it will swim away from it because it can feel the magnet, which obviously we can't feel a magnet, but they can. They typically use internal fertilization, so they mate with each other. And they have a couple of things that happen with their offspring, and this may surprise you a little bit. So some of them are oviparous. That means they just lay their eggs. They're fertilized eggs. Sometimes they lay the eggs in what's called a mermaid's purse. So this is a mermaid's purse. It's like a little pouch that gets released into the water. So the mother isn't taking care of this mermaid's purse, but it's a little protective coating for her eggs. Some of them are ovoviparous, which means that they have an egg that stays inside of the female, but there's no placenta to feed it. And so this can then cause live birth. And so I want to mention this because sometimes people think like live birth is always associated with mammals, but as we'll talk about later on, the specific mammalian trait is actually milk production is the key. So you can have sharks, for example, that do live birth, but they don't produce milk. And then viviparous organisms have eggs that develop in a uterus and actually have a placenta that feeds their young. Okay, so there's a lot of diversity in how sharks raise their young. Okay, so moving on to the bony fishes. So as the name suggests, one of their defining traits is that they have bone instead of cartilage for their skeleton. There's two major groups of bony fishes, the ray-finned fishes and the lobe-finned fishes, or Actinopterygiae and Sarcopterygiae. Those are mouthfuls. So again, I mentioned the bony skeleton. They also have scale-covered skin. They have an operculum. So this is that structure I was mentioning that moves on their gills and that basically keeps water always moving across their gills, even if their bodies aren't moving. They were the first organisms with lungs. So again, this is what I was mentioning earlier. We actually consider fish to be the first organisms to evolve lungs. Now, what happened is that the fish ancestor that had lungs mostly had the lungs evolve into a different structure. So lungs would become the swim bladder in modern fish. So there was a fish that had gills and lungs. Okay, so let me do a little. So the ancestor has gills and lungs, and then the gills are retained, and the lung becomes a swim bladder. Okay, and the swim bladder has a different function. The swim bladder is for buoyancy. So it fills with air usually, and it makes the fish float. So remember I said that sharks have to keep moving, otherwise they would sink. The fish don't have to keep moving because they have this swim bladder that fills with air and makes them float in water without moving. Okay. So the lungs give rise to the swim bladder. The gills are still retained for O2. Okay, to extract O2 from the water. So why did the ancestor have gills and lungs? Well, gills and lungs often occur in combo in order to increase oxygen uptake. So if the oxygen in the water is very low, then an organism might need supplemental oxygen by breathing air. And we'll see an example of an organism like that. But if the organism lives in oxygen-rich water, then gills are sufficient for extracting oxygen. Reproduction in bony fishes usually occurs via external fertilization. So that means the male just releases the sperm into the water, and the eggs are laid in the water. So Actinopterygiae, as I mentioned, is the ray-finned fish. So most bony fish are in this category. They get their name ray-finned fish because their fins have these thin bony structures called rays. They're flexible. So they're like these lines here that you can see in this fin. I'm just going to sketch those in. And then to move these fins, the fish has to use muscles in the main part of its body. It doesn't have muscle here. So there's no muscle moving this. There's no muscle moving it in the fin, okay, which is why they can be so thin and look so bony. So most of the fish that you think of are ray-finned fish. So I've listed some examples here: trout, salmon, tilapia, pollock. So all the ones we eat, tuna, belong to this category. The lobe-finned fish, so highlighting the difference here in the name, we talked about ray-finned fish. Now we're looking at lobe-finned fish, have very different fin structure. Instead of having just these rays, they actually have skeletal extensions of the pectoral and pelvic areas. So these are kind of embedded into the bone structure of the main part of the body, and they're moved by muscles in the fin rather than relying on muscles in the main part of the body. So this is much more like our limbs, and that's the really significant part here. The musculature and the bone is much more like the limbs that are present in other vertebrates, and less like the ray-finned fish. And that's what this is kind of showing here. So these are modern Sarcopterygiae, the lungfishes. And then we see some ancestor fish in here as well. And so what this is highlighting here is the bones that are related to bones in other vertebrates. So the humerus is this bone here. The ulna and the radius are in this part of your arm. And so we see in the lungfishes what is related to the humerus, and then we see in later evolved relatives of modern fish, modern lobe-finned organisms, and then transitional organisms. Tiktaalik is a fishapod. The ulna and the radius bone structure also arising. So again, this is showing that lungfishes are starting to have one of the steps towards having a modern limb, and that would be a gradual process through, these are all extinct organisms today. This would be a gradual process where bone arises that would eventually be like the bone of bone that's present in the limbs of amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Okay, so that's the significance there. So the coelacanths are one type of lobed-finned fish. They're a little bit unusual in that their swim bladder is filled with oil rather than gas, but oil also floats on water, so this still accomplishes buoyancy. So they do have a swim bladder, and again, remember this would have evolved from the lung in an ancestor. The lungfish are lobe-finned fish that live in oxygen-poor water, so they retain both gills and lungs. So there's very low oxygen where they live. So like I mentioned earlier, they need the lungs to provide extra oxygen. The gills are not enough. So again, they have the ancestors' lungs rather than having a swim bladder. They have particularly muscular lobe fins. Again, remember that that they live in oxygen-poor freshwater, and they often live in shallow water or near shallow water. And so this muscular lobe fin can actually let them kind of bear weight, not their full weight, but bear some of their weight on the bottom of a lake or on a drying lake. So they can actually push on that and move and drag themselves even through mud with those lobed fins. So again, illustrating how these are very structurally different from the ray-finned fish.